This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your host, Radio Joe Hughes, and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day, wherever you're listening from, and welcome to IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio. It's Friday, May 3rd, 2019 or something like that. I'm losing track of the year anymore. We've got a great interview today, John Downey. We're calling this an intimate interview with the cleaning industry's original, the life and times of John Downey, a trailblazer, troublemaker, and Buckeye. So we're going to look forward to it. Before we get started, let's thank our marquee sponsor.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com.
I also want to thank our gold sponsors, Particles Plus, Healthy Indoors Magazine, Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, and AEML Inc. Laboratory. And, of course, our association sponsors, CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute, the Indoor Air Quality Association, and the Restoration Industry Association.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man with this week's IAQ Radio Trivia question.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry to report that no one identified enthalpy as the property of thermodynamic system that is equal to the system's internal energy plus the product of its pressure and volume therein. The IQ Radio Trivia question for today, Friday, May 3rd, 2019, has been sponsored by Ideas, the solution chemistry company providing unique solutions to odor removal, surface cleaning, and decontamination problems. Here's today's trivia question. What former Ohio State football coach also coached two NFL teams? Back to you, Joe.
Okay, today we've got John Downey. John is the Executive Director of CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. He is also the fourth-generation president and owner of Downey's Carpet Care of Granville, Ohio. Also the founder of Cleanfax magazine, a longtime industry trade publication he sold in 1999. He has been a longtime industry association leader, volunteer, and member of numerous committees and board of directors. His industry connections are second to none, and he is respected as a man of his word that listens to both sides of an issue prior to making his own decisions on the proper decision to take. John, do we have you online?
Sure do, Joe. Thank you for the
John, we've had you before, but in kind of different contexts. Today we want to get into your history and your family history a little bit too. I think it's something that people can learn a lot from. I found it interesting reading the little kind of autobiography you wrote, 4, 5, 6 pages. I thought it was very interesting. Cliff, I think what I'd like to do is let you start this off.
Okay, good. Thanks. Hey, John, thanks for joining us today. Been looking forward to this for a long time. I think in order to put things into context, I don't know anyone personally with deeper roots in the cleaning industry than you. So what I'd like you to do, if you could, take us back to the very beginning about how your family got involved in the cleaning industry and when and where.
Sure, be happy to do that. I think that story kind of is what captured Joe here about a week ago when we had a conversation with some people from Ohio State. As I said then, and Joe was kind of flabbergasted, I am a son of a son of a son of a carpet cleaner. And my kids are sons of sons of sons of sons of carpet cleaners. So we trace our history in the business to 1897. So it's what's been 122 years. And one of the interesting things about that is that when the first John M. Downey got involved in the carpet cleaning business, he went to work for his brother-in-law, whose name was Martin. And today, and he went to work for Martin, I think it was maybe 1889 or 1892, something like that. And today, both companies still are in existence in Columbus, Ohio, Martin Carpet Cleaning and John M. Downey Carpet Cleaning. So the other thing I said to Joe that I think made an impression is we were in carpet cleaning before there was carpet. So, real visionaries.
True visionaries.
Well, let's talk about really your direct connection then, I think, a little bit, perhaps with, with your father and that business and, what led you to go into it?
I always just felt I would end up running the family business. So that, as far as me getting into it, that I just thought that was what was my destiny. And it's interesting that what we think our destiny is and what it actually is are not necessarily, where we're led over time is not necessarily the same. Dad was, and I'll go back even to, if I could briefly, to the original stuff. My great-grandfather, who I never knew my grandfather either. My great-grandfather had 3 companies, very, very entrepreneurial. He had a bakery, and in the back room, he had a boxing ring, and maybe another time we'll talk about the Downey boxers. I had 3 great uncles who boxed professionally. One boxed for the world's middleweight championship. And then behind the boxing ring, there was a rug cleaning plant or area. So he had a he had his own mini conglomerate. And as years went by, his wife died, and then he remarried a woman who didn't really get along with his kids. He had 8 kids, which my dad also had 8 kids. I have 9. And they didn't really get along. And when he died, he left the business to my grandfather, but his stepmother contested the will. So there was a brouhaha, and she got the phone number and he got the name. She got the name, he got the phone number. So there was a split in the family then. There were subsequent splits in the family business over the years since. My grandfather was a bit of a drunk. He was a good businessman, and but he was a better drinker. And Dad used to tell the story, and I think this is pretty interesting, about our grandfather's business during the Depression. And that was, Dad said they never had a problem earning a living during the Depression. It's something I learned from. And Dad's memory of Grandpa's business was driving through the streets of Bexley, which was a high income area in Columbus back in the day, still is actually, on the back of a flatbed truck. Grandpa was driving, and he had a microphone, or a megaphone, if you will, and they drive slowly down the street and say, "It's Downey's, bring out your rugs. It's Downey's, bring out your rugs." And about every couple times a block, somebody would come to the door and wave at them, tell them to stop, and they'd run in and they'd get the rugs and come back out. And he had a very, very successful business that way.
I didn't realize. You say you never met your grandfather?
I never met. He died a couple years before I was born.
But it was obvious in your writing that he had a big influence on you. At least that was the impression I got. Where did you learn about your grandfather? From your father telling you stories, or how did that work?
Yeah, my father telling stories, my aunts and uncles telling stories. There were, well, he was a colorful man. I'm not sure that he had a bit of an impression, but I'm not sure it was entirely positive. However, in fact, there's some stories we aren't going to talk about here that were pretty negative about my grandfather. But the thing about him was there were a lot of things in Dad that came through his father and that I recognized in Dad, and some of them for good and some of them not so good. The drinking was also a problem that afflicted my father and a lot of the Irish. So again, it was those stories. I knew my grandmother on Dad's side. She lived until the late 1960s, and she was just a kindly old woman, But at that point, I don't remember ever talking to her about Grandpa. Talked to Dad. My mother actually liked my grandfather a lot.
Interesting, John. So I'm just curious about the boxing side of things. What happened to the boxing ring? Did that go away, or did you do a little boxing in your day?
I did not. Well, I shouldn't say I did not. Actually, we did a little boxing in the basement when we were kids, but I never took it up in any significant way.
Okay.
My one brother, Mike, in particular, was in his day a accomplished fighter. I was about the only one that ever beat him up because I'm older than him. And when we were both teenagers, I think I was 16 or 17, he was a year younger. I still remember this day. It was the last time we ever fought because I did not beat him. So once that happened, nope, no more fighting.
The tide had turned. Well, it sounds like your grandfather was a pretty interesting business owner that had different marketing and advertising innovations. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the innovations in advertising and subcontracting, et cetera, that came through the family?
Well, that was actually my dad. That wasn't my grandfather. That was Dad. Dad is, in one of the questions ahead of time that Cliff asked about was people that were influencers on me and people I admire. My father would be one. I think he's probably the most innovative man that I've ever known well, and is responsible for an awful lot of things that may not all of them are considered good, but I know his heart, and I know that what he did was intended to be for the best, and I think all in all it was. But Dad, probably the most significant thing Dad came up with is what he called flat rate pricing, and we today call room pricing. And he came up with that in the early 1960s. As he was trying to figure out a way to merchandise carpet cleaning and build a larger market for carpet cleaning. Up until that time, there really weren't any large companies. Everybody, the model, which is still accepted today as one of the models, was, you would advertise to get leads, and then you'd go out and you'd do estimates. And from the estimate, if you were a good salesman, you'd get work and build a business that way. Dad thought that there needed to be a way to promote the business in a successfully using mass media, and he came up with different ideas, and the one that really worked was room pricing, or as I said, he called it flat rate pricing. This was in the early 60s, and he he advertised. He would advertise on the radio. He had a great radio voice, and he advertised on the radio in Columbus. Any size living room and hall for $19.95. Any size living room, dining room, and hall for $29.95. Other rooms were priced by the square foot, but that was the pricing, and it worked like a charm. I can't remember exactly what the numbers are right now, but I remember him talking about how he was going to consider he had to get a certain rate of response within the first 24 hours to continue. This was a radio ad that might run on WTVN in Columbus. And I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, but it was like a 24-hour period that he basically was measuring. And he reached that number in about 2 hours.
Wow.
And when that happened, he said, I knew immediately I've got a winner here. And basically he built a very substantial business. He raised a large family in a very comfortable style, based as much as anything on that concept.
And that continues today. I mean, but going back to when he started it, was that, as I understand it, that was a bit controversial in the cleaning industry, or in the carpet cleaning industry. Can you tell us why?
Very controversial. And I'm not sure that it is looked down on today, but it was for a long time. I mean, for probably the first 20 years of my career, room pricers were considered pariahs. And the problem with room pricing is that it lends itself to low guy wins. And the consequence of that was that the carpet cleaning industry, again, I'm not sure how prevalent it is today, but for a number of years, a lot of companies came into the industry who were basically bait and switch operators. They weren't really carpet cleaners. They go in and they would tell you, we'll clean 3 rooms for $19, whole house for $29. And they had no intention of doing that. They would go, that basically was to get the door open. Then they'd go in and they would really hard sell. I had a sister in Florida, Lori, who called me once, and she had one of them in her home. And she said, and we were laughing as they did it, because I told her exactly what was going to happen. She said, he came in and he looked at it and he said, well, I can do this, but you really need something more. And then he put you need a pre-spray, and he put it down and cleaned the spot in the carpet. He said, now that's going to cost more. And she said, well, what's it cost? And it was like $500. And I think it was at that point that she called me, and she told me what was going on. I said, I guarantee you, he's going to call his office next, and he's going to try and get and he's going to talk to the manager, who's going to come back with a lower price.
Yep.
And not 2 minutes later, that's exactly what happened. So I don't want to get too far off on that tangent, but that was the problem, still is potentially the problem with room pricing, is that the lowest guy wins. The reason Dad did it is he wanted a way, and he was effective at communicating a way to the consumer that carpet cleaning was something that could be done at a reasonable cost.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big mystery up until that time. And a reasonable cut, 1995 to clean a room and a hallway in 1962 was pretty good money. It wasn't bad. $30 to clean a living room, dining room, and hall, if you look at constant dollars. But it was true that the bad guys did come in, and I will share very quickly. I can't resist. in part because of a comment that Pete made in our show prep about a meeting in California, the Lynch Squad meeting or something like that. Shortly after Dad ran the commercials and started booking a lot of work there, he was the vice president of the Columbus Carpet Cleaners Association. And they called a special meeting, and he got to the meeting. He used to describe it. He said, I was seated in a chair in the middle of a semicircle of other cleaners, and they basically took turns pointing and shouting at me. He said, in particular, he remembered the guy's name was Denny Dickey. He said he was the president, and he said he had spittle on the side. He was so mad, he had spittle on the side of his mouth, and his voice was shaking. And he said, what you are doing will be the ruination of the carpet cleaning industry.
Wow.
And to some, that's exactly what happened. Now, I don't agree with that, but
I got a technical question or two here, and let's Cliff and Pete. Cliff, do you want to jump in or?
Well, no, I'd like to hear about the subcontracting idea, and then I want you to tell us about the, about a path your father could have taken. He went left and West Bates went right. So I kind of want to get into the West Bates if you could.
Okay.
So let's do subcontracting and then West Bates.
Subcontracting first.
Okay.
Dad, once he had a model for getting business, he felt he needed a simple way of keeping his costs consistent. And he also, he was kind of a newcomer, even though the company had been around a long time. He was kind of the newcomer coming back into the business after having been away. So he had some employees that were younger guys, they were South Enders in Columbus, and he needed a way to build responsible workers, and his idea was to make them, as he would describe it, my cleaners were my partners. He paid them 50%. He got the business, they did the business, and they were subcontractors, as it's looked at now. But his concept was, they're my partners, and because of the way he approached things, and also because of his personality, he wanted to give them responsibility, and he was spot on in so many ways. Because by giving them that responsibility, they working for Dad, they felt the need to own up to that responsibility. And so they built a very long-term workforce. I mean, our guys, I remember when I was first running the carpet cleaning business in the late 1970s, I think the average worker had been there, contractor had been there over 20 years. And so we had there was a lot of mutual respect and a good dynamic. Of course, there is a downside to using subcontractors. You don't have control if they aren't doing a good job. Similar to what happened with room pricing, a lot of the bait and switch guys use subcontractors, and they use it just so that they could not be responsible for paying people a living wage. Because if I went in as a subcontractor to clean 3 rooms for $15, he's losing money. He's not making anything. So, there's pros and cons of it. It worked really well for Dad.
Hey, John, real quick, at that time, how were they cleaning? Was it hot water extraction or was it some variation?
Hot water extraction really wasn't developed till the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s. When Dad first started, it was all shampoo extraction cleaning.
Okay.
There was a machine that Dad's company used called a chemstractor. I don't know, Cliff, you probably remember chemstractor. Pete, I would imagine you probably used one once upon a time.
Yeah, he had to empty it about once a month for what it actually extracted. But
exactly.
In any event, it was a cool machine for sure.
It was, and it was an interesting. One thing they were really good at is they pile lifted first, right. And then so that they would lift and open the pile, they'd vacuum, and then did they remove a lot of dirt? No. They really did, but they improved the appearance.
But I think the shampoo, when it crystallized and they vacuumed it subsequently, I think, in many ways, the industry's kind of gone back in that direction, right, with this very low moisture. And I don't think technically there's been a lot of changes, although, now they say it's polymers and so on and so forth. I
completely agree.
think the formulations change. Yeah. So tell us about your dad's buddy, Wes Bates. I think that's a story worth telling.
Well, it was Jack Bates.
Wes was the son. Okay.
Right. Jack was a friend of a drinking buddy of my father's. He had a company called Jack Bates Mr. Carpet Cleaning, I think was his company. And he also had a car wash, as I recall. But, and I will tip my hand by saying Jack Bates was the founder of Stanley Steamer. Dad was a person who, pretty much the person who introduced Jack to steam, quote unquote, steam cleaning. Hot water extraction was called steam cleaning at that time. There was this was in the late 60s, probably 68 or 69. Dad was the original Steamway distributor and used Steamway equipment in Ohio. And there was a bar on the Ohio State campus. Has anybody mentioned that I'm an Ohio State fan, by the way? Or is that coming later? Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Pete.
To me, it sounds like one of those cartoons and all those little marching around. But go ahead.
You have to have the whole treatment, Zlotnick.
Understood.
Anyway, there was a bar at the Ohio State, off of Ohio State's campus, called the Agora, and Dad was called to do an estimate, and he decided to go ahead and bring his Steamway machine and do a demo when he did the estimate. And he was there doing the estimate, and while he was there, Jack Bates happened to walk in, and Dad saw him, and so Dad walked over to him and looked at him, and my dad was a pretty charismatic guy and had a pretty funny way about himself. He said, "Well, Jack, that's called a steam cleaner. What do you think of it?" He said that Bates, I hope it's okay if I use a 4-letter word because I'm...
Go for it.
No problem.
It's not a bad one, but this is a direct quote. So Bates kind of looked at it for a minute, he kind of glared at Dad and looked back down, and then he turned to Dad again and he said, "Jack," that was what he called my dad Jack too. He said, "That piece of shit will never clean anything." And then he stormed off. Within 6 months, he had his own equipment. I think it was less time than that. Within a year, I believe, maybe a year and a half, he was building his own equipment. And not too long after that, he launched the Stanley Steamer franchise, maybe a couple years later. So that was one of the areas where Jack Bates got the best of my dad. He got my best of my dad in several things.
But the difference is, I think both men had the same idea. I think they wanted to partner with people that they could trust. And your dad went to the left, and
Dad went with subcontractors.
Bates went to the right, and I think they're both good systems. And today it depends how you want to do it, but I think they're both successful systems.
I think that Bates chose more wisely going with franchises. It certainly worked out that way for him over the years. But again, everybody has different. I mean, it was interesting, and Cliff, you really picked up on that. How really they were looking at the same concept and same model, and then finding different ways to make it work, and it really worked well for Bates.
Mm-hmm. This might be a good time. We've got to take a short break and thank our sponsors. And then when we come back, I don't know if we want to start into the rise of the industry associations, Cliff, or if you have some finishing up to do on John's background.
No, I think we're good
with the rest of our interview with Mr. John Downey, the Buckeye.
John Donne Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Gold sponsors are Particles Plus Engineers and Manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters and air quality monitoring instrumentation. Learn more at particlesplus.com. Count on us. Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com. And AEML Laboratories, free FedEx shipping, great pricing, same-day results, and never a rush fee. Learn more at AEMLinc.com. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com. Association sponsors are the Indoor Air Quality Association, a multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Learn more at IAQA.org. And RIA, the Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry. Network with leaders. Learn more at restorationindustry.org.
CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. Learn more at ciriscience.org. That's CIRI science.org. All right, we're back. Second half of our interview. We've got John Downey, the life and times of John Downey. I love it. All right, Cliff, I'm going to take it back to you. I think we're getting ready to start into.
Yeah, John, I'm not sure if you know the answer to this question, but I'm sure you'll know the answer to the second question. You'd mentioned that your dad was involved in a Columbus Rug Cleaning Association. Any idea, why that was formed?
No, I don't know. I really don't know. I would have to speculate that was kind of a common practice for local associations, maybe through the 50s and into the 60s. That would be my best guess.
Okay. Let's talk about your involvement with associations. Why did, UCCI come about? Because I think it was kind of the similar times that Tri-State came about. Why did this happen? Why did we need associations?
I think what spurred the growth of associations was Stainmaster carpet. And more specifically, the introduction of Stainmaster carpet by DuPont. When they introduced it, they decided they needed to have a national contract to maintain Stainmaster carpet. And they chose Stanley Steamer to be the exclusive cleaner for Stainmaster carpet. It's funny. Once again, we're back to Stanley Steamer. We're that Central Ohio crazy people connection.
What year is this, John? Ballpark?
19. 79, I believe.
In around 1980. Okay.
79, 80, maybe even 81. Might have been 81. But the independent carpet cleaners felt, when that happened, they felt, help me with the word,
Threatened?
vulnerable, I think would be the, and the UCCI, the United Carpet Cleaners Institute, formed, I mean, within 6 months of when that was announced, actually probably less time than that, we started meeting and organizing. And within probably 6 months, the UCCI was up and running, and it grew to 250, 300 members in a pretty short time, 2 or 3 years. Prior to that, there had also been an Ohio Carpet Cleaners Association that was not as strong. It pretty much was just a trade show, and it was kind of cliquey. And when things get cliquey, then things start to get political and ugly. So the UCCI's model, and I suspect Tri-State might have been similar, Cliff, and I know that several of the others were, was not to just be a trade show, but to have regular monthly meetings. The UCCI, we had chapters in Columbus and Cleveland and Cincinnati and Toledo and Detroit. And the idea was to establish, basically cordial relationships with your competitors, and so that you could basically not have all this fear stuff that came into play. I remember, by the way, I just thought of this, early on with UCCI, once UCCI was started, Stanley Steamer got word of it, and we had a meeting at my father's company's office, and 2 people, one was the attorney, and maybe the other was the CFO of Stanley Steamer, came to check us out. So they were paying attention to what the independent carpet cleaners were doing, and the independents had a big effect, because then you get into what happened with DuPont when the independent guys kind of got together and started talking as one voice to the specifically to DuPont, but to the carpet and fiber manufacturers about the fact that there's a big industry out there that you guys aren't paying any attention to, and there are thousands upon thousands of us. They changed their tune. They basically decided, we need to be inclusive, not exclusive in what we do. So I think after about a year, they ended that exclusive deal with Stanley Steamer. It still served Stanley extremely well.
Right.
But they maybe a year or 2, they ended that and became much more involved in a proactive way in the carpet cleaning industry.
My observation is that when Tri-State got started, it was before the Stainmaster thing, but I think one of the drivers for Tri-State was this battle over the word of being able to call it steam cleaning, and because I think the DuraClean folks challenged and said that it wasn't steam, and said that you couldn't use steam in the yellow pages, and that was one of the primary drivers, I think, as well. So I guess the observation is that it's good for associations when there's a threat to members and potential members, and it's bad for associations when there's tranquility and there is no threat. So, I mean, that's just an observation.
You're exactly right.
I'm not sure if you agree with it or you don't. Well, how did you become an activist?
This may sound funny, but I don't consider myself an activist. I certainly can understand why others view me that way, and I've thought about this. The way I've been blessed in many ways. I've also found myself, I put myself, especially with Cleanfax, in a position of responsibility, in a position where I knew things, I had beliefs about right and wrong, and I was in a position where I could kind of see what was really going on. And when I saw things that were going on that I felt were wrong,
You called it out.
I call it, yeah, I what is it my kids say? Tell them your truth, Dad, tell them your truth. So,
And I think if you lived in Chicago, they might call you a carpet cleaning organizer or something like that.
But yeah, I it's just been something where I have felt at times a responsibility to speak up, and I've fortunately had a platform, and so I guess I can see that I would be viewed as a rabble rouser. I've got a little bit of spunk in me as well, so that's probably part of it.
Well, how did you end up? How'd you end up in the publishing business?
Yeah.
Well, that was because of UCCI. It's a great story. Here I am, patting myself on the back. It's a great story. It's a great story in the sense of you never know what's going to happen. You think you know your path, and then all of a sudden it changes completely. And we all need to remember that. As I told you earlier, I thought I would just grow up and take over the family business, and that would be my path, but it didn't work out that way. I left the family company. I don't know that we have time to get into that story, but I left the family company in maybe 82 or 3, and I was the founding vice president of the UCCI. And the UCCI vice president's job was to publish the association newsletter. And by the way, the UCCI got their bylaws from the Carpet CFI or CCI. CCI in California. And we just followed their bylaws. And their bylaws said, vice president's job is publish the newsletter. So I started doing that. I had no grand ambitions. It was just a responsibility. But I found I enjoyed doing it, and the board liked what I did. And so they gave me more money to grow it into a larger newsletter. And in time, it became a small magazine. When it became this small magazine, we had to generate advertising in order to defray the costs of it. And on a regional basis, you could not justify the amount for advertising against the cost for publication. So I came up with the idea of taking what had become Cleanfax. It started out as UCCI newsletter, then we became Clean Scene or Cleaning Scene. Then it became Cleanfax. And the FAX was just because at that time fax machines were new and trendy, so we wanted to be cool. So I went to the UCCI board of directors. I said, I want to take this national with your blessing. And initially I asked them if they wanted to take it national. They didn't have that ambition. So I said, I take it national. We will have regional editions for each part of the country with regional content. The national part of the magazine would be the same everywhere, and we would recruit regional trade associations to be sponsors of the different regional editions. And of course, UCCI was the first regional association sponsor. And that's where it just kind of came from there. Just kind of happened.
And you never envisioned being a writer. You didn't, if I'm not mistaken, you didn't go to college for that, or, how did you end up? I mean, you are now a terrific writer. I'm just curious, how did you get better at that?
I think, honestly, I think that you credit God or genetics or whatever. I mean, I had a knack for writing. I never really developed. I never really recognized. I can tell you, actually, I did recognize it, but it was after I graduated high school. I was working in the family business. I sent a letter to somebody. I can't even remember what it was about, and it just came together really well. And that was me. I was, I didn't really think that.
I did that.
And so, I took courses. Honestly, I tell people all the time, I can't even diagram a sentence. I'm not I can diagram one now, but I don't like to. But I was at best a C student in English and composition in high school. I took some classes, some college classes in journalism and frankly English,
Okay.
in order to know what I knew. But it came naturally. It just came naturally, and I worked at it. And
Well, I'm sure you had to work at it.
some
John,
things that you do give you energy. Other things you do drain energy. Writing gives me energy.
John, tell us about the 7-year cycle of a publication.
Well, actually, it came from National Review. It was something I read about in National Review, which I've been a subscriber to National Review since the mid-1970s. And in National Review, they talked about the fact that a magazine, basically they should have a life of its own, and there's about a 7-year cycle in a magazine, that if you go beyond that or too far beyond that, it becomes stale. There's a need for new blood. You need to treat a publication. I always looked at Cleanfax as being almost like one of my children.
Mm-hmm.
It was something I birthed, but it wasn't me. And I think I was in part successful because I looked at it that way. It needed to have a life of its own, and it did. So, when I started Cleanfax, I started it with the end in mind that it would be about a 7-year gig for me. And then it needed to find a new home. It needed to go out and do more. It ended up being 9 years, I think. But it worked out that way.
This is probably the most important question I think I'm going to ask you, or anyone else is going to ask you today. Can you define entrepreneurial omnipotence?
Maybe I would equate it with foolhardiness.
Well, I think they're different.
Well, I saw your comment about that, and I'm not sure I am able to answer that. I say that in part because out of embarrassment, but I don't think there is such a thing as entrepreneurial omnipotence. I know in my case, and it was after I sold Cleanfax, and I made a lot of money with Cleanfax, including when I ran it and also when I sold it. And it's why I kind of go to the foolhardiness. I found myself trying to do things business-wise to satisfy or help others, but they were not really my passion. And so when you ask that question, I'm kind of thinking, and as I'm speaking, to me, entrepreneurial omnipotence is finding your passion. And if you find your passion and work in that area of where you have a passion, as an entrepreneur, you'll be successful. But when you wander outside of that area, at least for me, it was very easy to get lost, which I kind of did for about at least 5 years or more. Does that address what you're talking about, or?
No, I think you did, and I think you did it really in a unique way. The point that I was trying to get to was the fact that we're successful at doing something once, we automatically somehow think that we're going to be successful at everything we do.
And you're right.
And I think what happens is sometimes I think it's like gambling almost. When you win a bet, you then, I'm really smart, and I think what happens is, because you have one success, you think it's transferable to other industries. And I think it's a rude awakening sometimes when you find out it's not. But I do have another question that I'd like to ask you. And it's kind of personal, but tell me about, the feeling that you were adversely affecting your wife's health. I'd like to talk about that.
So I mentioned earlier that Cecilia and I have 9 kids. And after I had sold Cleanfax, and I did a few things related to the family business, made really stupid decisions. As you said, you're exactly right. Now that I totally get what you're saying, I suffered that delusion of omnipotence. But I then I started working with my brother Mike on. He invented a hot water extraction machine called a high flow extractor. The name of the machine and the company was Steam and Demon. And I started working with Mike. And I did have success working with Mike, especially when, I hate to say this, after Mike had a heart attack and kind of got out of the business and I was kind of running it on my own, we were able to do some things. But I'll tell you what, it was a really difficult business, really difficult. And I found myself on the road 2 and 3 weeks out of the month. And I was doing workshops for facilities. Steam and Demon's primary market is in the commercial cleaning world, buildings of various sorts, hospitals, schools, etc. And so I was working with janitorial companies and building service contractors and in-house people, but I was traveling all the time. And in the meantime, my wife, the mother of 9 children, when I'm on the road, she has to be both mother and father. And I'll tell you what, with any family, that's difficult. But with 9 kids, and by the way, I don't think I mentioned it, most of them at that time were teenagers, and teenagers are. And she had a serious health crisis. We weren't sure exactly what it was, but she was having seizures and a variety of different ailments. And I remember, she was in a hospital room, Licking Memorial Hospital, my local area. And the doctor said, you know what? There really isn't much that we can do for her. I mean, she's just overloaded. She is overloaded. And she was asleep in the bed, and I just looked at her, and I didn't say anything to her directly at the time. But I knew right then I was killing my wife, and I had to make a change. And I decided then and there, and I never looked back. And to make a change. I got out of the Steam and Demon business. I started a small company in my hometown of Granville, Ohio, owner-operator carpet cleaning company, so that I would not be gone all the time. Regardless of anything else, she needed the support of a husband who was there. And so that's what I did. There were some unpleasant financial consequences from that decision, but honest to God, I don't regret it at all. I mean, some things are more important than others.
Understood.
All right.
How about,
let's go to the roundup. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we ought to bring in the restoration industry's global watchdog. I'm sure he's been chomping at the bit there, ready to jump in here. Pete, what do you have to say, buddy?
Well, I've been typing the text messages, and I made my notes on an IICRC pad just out of, I'm not sure why I did it. It was just a paper here. But look, I got a list, but I'm going to go through it quick. In the little write-up that we did for the show, and of course there's so much in there you couldn't cover in an hour, you had talked about that you had a relationship with Dan Sullivan as a strategic coach. And that was probably in the 90s, a couple years after Cliff had first found that guy. He's from Canada, and he brought him to Restorex conference. And he defined an entrepreneur. And he said an entrepreneur is someone who never relies on anyone else for their livelihood. And the key to an entrepreneur is you give customers what they want. You hire people to take care of the customers to give them what they want. You'll have a successful business. The key thing is the entrepreneur gets paid last. A lot of business owners don't realize that. You get paid last. The guys that want to pull the money out of the company just because they can will never have a successful company. He was an interesting guy because he talked about people spend too much time trying to improve things that they're kind of weak at, and they don't spend enough time doing what they're really good at. So his argument was spend twice as much time on your strengths and moderate amounts of time on your weaknesses. He says it takes 21 days to change a habit, and the key is you can only do one habit at a time. That was it. That was his key pitch. Now, when Dina Dwyer, the daughter of the founder of Rainbow and Dwyer and that whole group, I remember when she was the keynote at the RAA about 3 or 4 years ago, she said something similar when she said one of the keys to success was to hire your weakness. Entrepreneurs hire the people who can do what they can't, but yet that smart person, maybe smarter than the entrepreneur, couldn't run a business. Our buddy,
Completely
Carpenter, me and Cliff, he ran his business like that. He had that. He called it his Kentucky sense, I'll tell you, when we were listening to you about the subcontracting stuff with your dad, I wondered, and we talked, we had this kind of offline. Ed York wrote in the early days of the SCT, he had these manuals, and you got a set of manuals when you joined the SCT in the 70s. They were all color-coded by marketing, management, operations, all this stuff. And he had one in there called the Associates Program, which was a concept of three things. You had what was called a procurement company, which is what your dad was, a sales company. They'd go get the work. Then the production company would be the workers, who they'd make them, their own bosses, and then they would do these splits, 50-50, 60-40, whatever it was. So it was a 3-part series. When I read your story about that, I'm wondering, did Ed York come up with that idea, or did did York steal the idea from your dad? Or did they both, independent of each other, just come up with the idea because it was really a fabulous idea? It was the way in the New York market that the restoration guys, they called them captive subs. That's how they built that entire market in the New York City market. A lot of guys that we know, all in New England and the Northeast, in the restoration area, but the roots started in the carpet cleaning. So I always thought that was interesting. Was it York or Downey Sr.? The room pricing thing is unbelievable. Matter of fact, Cliff, there was a guy from Indiana called Bob Keller. He was a lunatic, if you remember.
Oh, yeah, I
in
know.
a good way.
I know.
And there was a guy who came into his town that had 1995 a room written all over the truck, right? And at an old ASCR convention one day, he's telling me the story that guy's not around anymore. I said, what happened, Bob? He said, well, I showed up to his house at 2 o'clock in the morning with a shotgun. And I said, he'll be out of town by noon tomorrow. This is a true story, folks. You can't make it up. And there'll be no 1995 cleaning in this town. But the lynch mob thing, I had that story that you told about the Columbus carpet cleaning group, the way they basically gave your dad the Spanish Inquisition. I experienced that with Ed York and a bunch of friends of ours. I won't mention their names. Protect the innocent. But what happened is all the bigwigs that started the CCI, which is California, now is CFI, and a lot of those guys were past ASCR, big guys in ASCR back in the day. They were rabid about these room guys and the upsell and the bait and switchers. I mean, they were really unbelievable. And we'll leave it at that point. But I tell you, I got some stories over a drink we could talk about back in those days that were a riot. And York was right in the middle of all of it. One of the things, John, that was really something that I was really struck by, and when I read your story, is how you learned a lot as a young whippersnapper kid. You were the boss, and the guys who reported to you were the old pros that had worked for your dad for years. Well, I grew up in the industry in the 70s when I moved past, my janitorial roots, and I got into the cleaning and then discovered the associations. I worked for a couple guys like that too. The first company that I ever worked for was Schaefer, and Mr. Schaefer was the president for the first 2 years of the founding of NEIRC, which is the founding company of REA that we know today. Was up in the hill in Stamford, Connecticut. Triple S, Steve DeMarco eventually bought it for the main competitors. But I've always valued those days. They were really amazing, what we learned with those old cronies. And how we, as young whippersnappers, we didn't think they knew much, and we could teach them everything. And boy, how wrong we were. And then there was an old pro that I met one day in a building that was an ex-fireman. Ex-firemen were big in this business, in both restoration and carpet cleaning. And I remember I ran into him one day in a janitorial contract. It was a big, high-profile building in downtown Stamford, Connecticut. And he said, "Oh, you're the young kid that's trying to steal the carpet cleaning contract from me." Like, little did I know at the time that the people who ran these big buildings didn't trust their carpet cleaning to the janitor, even if you were the best janitor in the world. And let me tell you, I started out, I was a pretty damn good one. That was a big lesson. We became buddies. He was the guy who told me about York, SCT, and as REA was known in the day, the Association of Interior Decor Specialists. I went to my first SCT convention in 1976 in the Wagon Wheel in Rockford, Illinois. That's a Cliff Out of Restorix guy there, Stephen Gitz, I think it is. Yeah. And then my very first convention for the REA was 1977 in the Sheraton Bell Harbor in Miami Beach. And the first table I sat with that I met, the first then, was the original Buzz Dahonian, the Buzz's original dad, Armin. And they welcomed me because back in those days, all the newcomers got to sit with the old timers, in the welcome reception, and you were kind of indoctrinated into the association. You don't see that much anymore, but I always appreciated that. Now I want to kind of talk about York. Downey, you made me laugh. I put it up there in the chat when you said you don't think you're an activist. What a bunch of BS that is. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of an old scene in a Steven Seagal movie when he was almost killed, and he's being nursed back by the old Indian chieftain. And the Indian chieftain compliments him or says something and compares him to the bear. And he goes, "Oh, no, he's all humble. I'm not like that." And the old Indian chieftain says, "Yes, that's exactly what the bear would say." You saying you're not an activist is the biggest understatement I ever heard. We all know that you, me, and Zlotnick, although Cliff has his own viewpoint in this, we're descendants of the tree of York. Ed York was the original activist, the original guy, in our industry. And when you were talking about Staymaster, he wrote an article called Carpetland. This thing never got published, But I saw it. I visited him one day up in the mountain in Camas, Washington, towards his last days. And he was so mad. And he wrote this thing called Carpetland. And he talked about Carpetland and about the magic coat in the kingdom. And it disrupted Happy Carpetland. It was so cutting edge and so satirical and funny. It was a riot. Now, I don't know why the industry, Howard Orlansky, when he gave it to him at ICS, I almost thought he was going to have a heart attack. I said, Howard, you mean it's Ed? Come on, give me a break. I don't ever know what happened to that thing, but boy, he was something. So I think he was the inspiration for the Great Debate. You didn't talk about the Great Debate when Cliff asked it, but in your thing you did. The Great Debate was probably I think it was the predecessor to the commish and the Donneybrookes that REA started all those years ago. It was fabulous. The one great debate, if you recall, was when the first S500 was coming out. There was this battle between the old ASCR and the IICRC, and Denny Jensen and Larry Cooper had the great debate. Should it be a standard or is it a guideline? Which we found out was a moot point anyway at the end of the day. And I remember the great feature about that thing was that you each cited your position. Then they looked at the position and they did a rebuttal without knowing. The rebuttal is what made the great debate great. So I approached Downey in the years, Cliff, when I was working with Dryes, and I wanted to debate myself in the magazine. He thought I was crazy. I'm the only guy in the history of Cleanfax that debated himself. Pete Consigli debated Pete Consigli. I did both parts of the position, and I did the rebuttal. Now, what happens is, I was back in those days.
You're the only one I could imagine doing that.
And nobody could do it. So what happens is I'm out one day back when I did the big huge tours for Dryes, and back in those days you used to send the brochures out so everybody in the country knew where I was and what town, right? And I would get calls from guys like Ron Tony, Mike Schul, they'd wake me up in the middle of the night. But Barry Costa called me one time and he left a voice message and he goes, "Hey Pete," he says, I read the great debate. He said, I read the first side and I agree with it. And then he goes, I read the second side and agree with that too. He said, you're the schizophrenic consultant. I never thought of it like that. But anyway, I guess that was cool. It's too bad that something like that really doesn't exist in the industry. I think it should, in the social media age you're in, I don't know. But I always thought that was fabulous. And that was kind of the beginning. John, I really appreciate, I wrote for you. You're the first guy I wrote for, my first article, The Restoration Technicians, the Heart and Soul of Any Company. And I was always loyal to Cleanfax, and I never ever wrote for any other magazines besides C&R because I kind of figure, you go with the guys that brought you to the dance. When you sold Cleanfax, you broke my heart. Oh, my God. So Downey takes me up to the guy, Humphrey, that he sold the magazine to. They're in Albany. I said, hey, John, I'm going to drive up there, and we're going to meet him. About 5 minutes in the office, I asked him his editorial policy. And he was a nice guy, ran a big empire. But he basically said, they sit on the top of the fence. They don't want to take a position one way or the other because they don't want to piss off the advertisers. I'm going, oh, well, I'll never write for this guy, which I never did. Of course, 2 years later, he sold the magazine, and Jeff Cross became editor, and we were back in the game again, and that was always a good thing. And I think Jeff has really done a wonderful job of carrying on the legacy of Cleanfax. When you, I guess in closing, to tie it into the breaking news of the day, which we really haven't talked about, Cliff, but back in the 90s, you used to do the Cleanfax Man of the Year, and you went out on the edge. You recognize some of the old cronies. We won't say who they are. They're not particularly favorites of guys like me and Cliff, but that's okay. But they're industry guys, and they did their due, and you honored them. You were an honest broker. And a lot of times they kind of became the group to then, get the next guy, right? But I remember one year, and I don't think you did this every year, you listed me in there as an honorable mention. It was the year that Joe Polish won the award. And you listed me as an honorable mention, and you specifically said, based on the work that I tried to do in the 90s to bring together the ASCR and the IICRC. And it's funny, in the late 90s, Sue Valente, who's on this call, when she ran that big, the that healthy indoor and healthy environments before IAQA. Her and Glenn Feldman ran that for that publication I worked for. Me and Tommy Iaqradio won their service award for the same kind of deal, that they recognized us and Tommy for trying to bring the industry together, right? And I always remember that. My point is that what I learned out of that, and I had very close friends of mine, I won't mention their names, but very close friends of me and Cliff that told me, they said, you know, Pete, that work is all well and good, and you know, we admire you for doing it, but it's like riding two horses. And if you ride two horses, eventually you get pulled apart. And at the end of the day, neither group really appreciates what you did because they don't know where you stand. And I had true friends tell me that, so it wasn't BS. So what I learned from that as I came back from my sabbatical in the early part of the 21st century is you got to choose the horse you're going to ride, and you got to ride that horse. And with me, that it was RIA. I guess the roots of you recognizing me for doing that was part of a process that ultimately led to the MOU that was announced at the convention the other day to unify the industry. So many of us have worked for so long to make that happen. And that was a good day. So time will tell what's going to happen. You know, like my mom taught me, you know, age is a function of time, but youth is a state of mind. So,
well said.
I wish we'll all remain forever young in our heart. So anyway, I really enjoyed reading your miniseries. That whole deal was unbelievable. My little commentary in there, I really had a strategy for that. We could do a show. It was amazing. I learned a lot of stuff about you that I didn't know, and probably some of my little color commentary kind of did the same. So anyway,
one thing real quick, the great debate, and I agree with you, it was really the signature part of Cleanfax that described it. But it didn't come from York, it didn't come from the industry. It came from National Review, because they used to do debates in National Review. I even followed the same format as what National Review had. So
yeah, no, I didn't mean it came from York. I meant the spirit of York. You know, may have had something to do with it. But you're right. Back in the day, with Tucker Carlson, all those guys, they used to do the debates. You know, when they used to be on CNN before Fox was around. And then if you remember Saturday Night Live, that had that dialogue with Chevy Chase and Jane Curtin, but they used to do a mimic and comic it about, you know, doing that. Yeah. So, but anyway, it was fabulous the way you packaged it, John. It was the highlight of the Cleanfax, and I think it served the issues of the day in the '90s. You're way ahead of your time. Anyway, Joe, Cliff, I know we ran over. I appreciate the indulgence. I'll turn it back to you boys.
Thank you, Pete. Before we go, John, you know, Pete mentioned this memorandum of understanding. I wonder if you could comment on that before we go. I guess IICRC and RIA have finally come to some kind of agreement. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I guess in the big picture, I think it's a welcome development and something that I hope will bear fruit long term. RIA or RIA's predecessor, I think it was ASCR at that time,
yep.
and IICRC have played together at times, and then things have fallen apart. I hope that doesn't happen. I have talked at length with the person that if Cleanfax still had a person of the year, the person of the year for 2019 would be Mark Springer, who is the person whose determination is the reason for this agreement. I give the IICRC credit for engaging with Mark and engaging with RIA. I don't know enough about the details to comment on that, but I know Mark's heart and where Mark is coming from, and he's a new generation guy. He's the next generation. And the main thing I would want to say about it is, let's give it a chance. Let's put aside history and you know what I was just saying, that there've been things in the past. Let's put that aside and give it a chance. You know, the IICRC has agreed to partner with RIA on some things. I hope, as much as anything, I hope it's just a start, because that sort of thing, it has been needed in the industry on a variety of levels for a long time. So I'm heartened by it. I'm really glad for Mark. I know how much he put into it, and you know, time will tell. But let's pray it all goes well and develops even more.
Cliff, before we go, any final thoughts?
Yeah, there's one. I have one other question for you, John. And you know, I think that, you know, in our industry and life, you know, this term workaholic comes up, and a lot of times, you know, people bear it as some sort of badge of honor. And I know that, you know, after reading your words on it, you kind of have a different opinion, and I would just like you to just lay it out.
Being a workaholic is an affliction. It's no less of an affliction than alcoholism or drug abuse or anything else. Not anything else. They're all different afflictions, and we bring them on ourselves. I'm a workaholic. I'd like to think I'm in recovery.
Right.
However, I'm working my butt off.
Understood.
Hi, John.
So, but it's, as much as anything, it's a state of mind. And the workaholic loses so much of the important things in life because he is so addicted to that process of business, the thrill of you know, making the sale, doing this or that or the other. And no, I don't. Anybody that tells me pridefully that they're a workaholic, I'd slap them upside the head and say, hey, get over that. That's not a good thing. We need balance in our lives. If our work is number one in our life, and too often it's been for me, we're missing the important things.
I agree.
Thanks for asking that.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, John Downey. I tell you, it's been a fascinating and interesting week just learning more about you, and then capped off with today's interview. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Joe.
This is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks to our guest, John Downey, of course, to the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, Pete Consigli, the restoration industry's global watchdog. John, you got to have faith that the controls, most importantly, our growing group of loyal listeners. I will be on the road next week. We're not going to have a show next week, but in 2 weeks, we will be back, and I think that's when we have the show lined up with Ed Cross and some of the restoration industry groups. So we'll be talking a lot more about that big announcement that came out this week where RIA and IICRC are going to be working together, and look forward to updating listeners a little more on that in 2 weeks from today when we return for the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Rio saying thanks for listening.